The graduation rate of our high school students was less than 30%. Unemployment was at an all-time high. And over the last 30 years, we have completely reversed that. Over 97% of our families are employed. 98% of our children graduate from high school. And it's just a thriving community.
Hi there. I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of The Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Ilham Askia, a nonprofit director in Atlanta who has worked on some of the most challenging issues in public policy, criminal justice reform and community development and housing. That was her you heard at the top. She'll talk to us about why so many defendants don't receive adequate legal representation, and also how a golf course is part of a major urban revitalization effort. That's coming up later in the episode. And in our Arts and Culture segment, we'll look at a special production of a classic play in Alabama. But first, in our weekly news roundup, we're seeing green, the color of cannabis. Even as use of the intoxicating herb has been legalized to one degree or another across much of the United States, the South remains the region least receptive to its embrace. That did not change during this year's legislative sessions. In fact, 3 southern states actually rolled back some previous allowances for certain kinds of products. One of them, Texas, enacted the region's first all-out ban on any kind of cannabis intoxicant, positioning the South's largest state as sort of an Alamo against the march of marijuana. The map of different legal statuses from state to state is complicated, and before I get further into it, I want to give a note on terminology. Weed policy aficionados will be familiar with all of this, but I think it could get confusing to the non-420 adjacent layperson. In these discussions, 3 different words tend to get thrown around: cannabis, marijuana, and hemp. The only one of those that's an actual biological term is cannabis, which is the plant that is at the heart of all of this. In shorthand, marijuana refers to strains of cannabis with higher concentrations of the psychoactive chemical THC, and hemp is what we call cannabis with lower levels of THC. Just as an aside, the word marijuana comes from Mexican Spanish, although its origins there are debated. The word came to be used widely in the United States during early 20th century panics over rising use of the drug and an influx of Mexican migrants during the Mexican Revolution. But cannabis was already known in the U.S. and used medicinally throughout the 1800s. Anyway, THC is the primary intoxicant in cannabis, and THC levels are what most of these laws revolve around. Under the Federal Farm Bill of 2018, it is legal to grow hemp, that is, cannabis with THC levels of 0.3% or less, anywhere in the United States. Federal law prohibits cannabis with higher concentrations of THC. But over the past 12 years, a growing number of states have legalized or decriminalized it anyway, creating our current confusing hodgepodge of regulations. There are now 24 states where possession of marijuana for adults is legal, and most of them have both commercial growers and retail outlets, although there's a lot of variation in how it's regulated. An additional 15 states allow medical marijuana if prescribed by a doctor, and those states also vary widely in terms of how they handle it. And then there are 11 states that basically allow no form of legal marijuana, although they do allow non-intoxicating CBD extracts. The South is split about half and half between states that completely ban marijuana, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, and states that allow some form of medical use, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mississippi. The exception is Virginia, the only southern state that has fully legalized marijuana for adults, who are allowed to grow up to 4 plants on their private property and possess up to 1 ounce. But the state has not yet permitted the commercial sale of the drug. The Virginia legislature passed a bill to allow retail sales in 2024, but Governor Glenn Youngkin, an opponent of legalization, vetoed it. Legislators passed a bill again this year, and in March, Youngkin vetoed it again. The state's voters will get a chance to weigh in on the issue this November in the next governor's race. Virginia governors are only allowed to serve 1 term, so Youngkin is not on the ballot. The race to succeed him is interesting. It pits the current Republican Lieutenant Governor, Winsome Earl Sears, against Democrat Abigail Spanberger, a former congresswoman. Both are women, and the winner will be Virginia's first female governor. Earl Sears would also be the state's second black governor and first black Republican governor. Spanberger supports allowing commercial use of marijuana. Earl Sears promises to oppose it. Recent polls have shown Spanberger with a large lead in the race, so Virginia may be moving toward a green light for weed. Texas, meanwhile, just turned flashing red. Marijuana was already illegal there, of course, but last week the Texas legislature imposed additional prohibitions on THC products produced from hemp. To understand this, we have to talk for a minute about the crazy explosion in hemp-derived THC since that 2018 Farm Bill. The hemp that's legal to grow under that bill has to have very low THC, but growers and creative cannabis entrepreneurs quickly found a loophole. Using chemical processes, you can concentrate those small amounts of THC into compounds potent enough to be intoxicating. State and federal laws banning marijuana specify a particular molecular makeup, what is called delta-9 THC. But if you change that molecule just a little, producing variants like delta-8 and delta-10, you can make something that is not technically illegal in many places, but can still give users a marijuana-like buzz. And so states across the country, and especially states that haven't legalized marijuana, have seen a rapid and largely unregulated growth in THC concentrates from hemp. States have again taken a variety of approaches to this issue. Hemp derivatives like delta-8 are actually illegal in some states that have legalized marijuana, including New York, Colorado, and Washington. But southern states have been slower to act. In the last few years, several have taken steps to regulate the sales of hemp products, limiting them to people over 21, charging special taxes on them. But the cannabis industry has already grown strong enough in many places to fend off complete bans. At least until Texas. The conservative legislature there overrode heavy lobbying by the industry and passed a bill at the end of May making it illegal to make or sell intoxicating hemp products. That will shut down what had become an $8 billion industry in the state. Here's how Republican Texas State Representative Tom Oliverson, who is an anesthesiologist, described the bill on the House floor.
It draws a bright, enforceable line with no wiggle room. It bans the sale of synthetic and semi-synthetic THC products, regardless of whether they come from hemp or marijuana. No more Delta-8, no more Delta-10, or chemically altered THC extracts. No more legal gray zones. We are not banning hemp. We are banning high. This amendment will preserve the right to grow industrial hemp and sell non-intoxicating CBD and CBG under current state and federal law. But if it gets you high, it is not legal anymore.
So no THC for Texas. But how about the other T state, Tennessee? It didn't go quite that far this year, but it did strongly curtail the volunteer state's cannabis businesses. The biggest change was it completely banned something called THCA, which is yet another compound. THCA has been by far the most popular hemp derivative in the state because when it is heated, like by someone smoking it, it essentially converts to plain old Delta-9 THC, aka marijuana. That was the argument that Republican State Senator Richard Briggs, also a doctor for what it's worth, made for banning it. Here's what he said on the Senate floor just before the bill passed in April.
To speak in plain English, if we vote this bill down, Tennessee has totally unregulated recreational marijuana.
Other hemp derivatives like Delta-8 will still be legal in Tennessee, although the bill will put some new restrictions on them, too. Sales will be banned in grocery stores and gas stations and limited to businesses that are restricted to people over 21 or are licensed by the State Alcoholic Beverage Commission. That will presumably be a boon to the state's wine and liquor stores, many of which already sell hemp products. And just south of Tennessee, Alabama's legislature also took a whack at its hemp THC market, banning all smokable products and putting new restrictions on the manufacture and sale of edible or drinkable THC. As in Tennessee, they will be licensed by the State Alcohol Board, and most will only be available in liquor stores or over 21 dispensaries. But there are some exceptions which will no doubt make some particular retail sectors happy. Hemp THC beverages can be sold at Alabama grocery stores, and topical and sublingual products, lotions and drops, can be sold at pharmacies. So basically, everybody gets a piece of the action, or at least the action that remains. What's noteworthy about all of these restrictions is that they appear to be at odds with what people who live in the states say they want. Nationwide, about 70% of Americans now say they support the legalization of marijuana. That number has been growing consistently for decades and has been over 50% since 2013, according to Gallup polls. That holds true across the South, with some variation. A poll in Texas this February found that more than 60% of adults surveyed favored full legalization. This is, after all, the state that's home to Willie Nelson. In Tennessee, a poll by Vanderbilt University last year found 63% of adults supported legal marijuana, including majorities of both Democrats and Republicans. A 2023 poll in Alabama also showed 61% support for full legalization. And in Florida, a majority of voters last year, 56%, voted to legalize marijuana in the state. But that was short of the 60% majority required by state law to pass a referendum. A legalization bill in the Florida legislature this year failed, although proponents are planning another try at a referendum in 2026. For now, in a country where only 11% of adults say they think marijuana should be fully illegal, the South remains a patchwork bastion of prohibition. I went to Atlanta a few months ago to talk to several people and also just to spend time in one of the South's great cities. I love Atlanta. I've visited many times on and off in the last 30 years. I've eaten a lot of good food, seen a lot of good music there, including Beyoncé on the Formation tour at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, which my oldest child requested. It was his first big concert. If you're thinking that a Beyoncé show in Atlanta probably gets pretty lively, you're right. It is also, of course, home to both the King Center and the Carter Center, which preserve the legacies of two of Georgia's most prominent political leaders. Both are very much worth visiting if you haven't. The King Center in particular is kind of an overwhelming experience, sitting right in the middle of the Sweet Auburn neighborhood where Martin Luther King Jr. grew up and next to the church where he preached. I first visited Atlanta in 1994 as it was preparing for the 1996 Olympics. The talk that I remember from those days wasn't excitement about the games, but frustration and concern about the 30,000 people forced to move to accommodate them. In the years since, Atlanta has often been caught in conflicts between the well-financed forces of new growth and the needs of the people who live there. One especially interesting approach to those challenges has come through something called the East Lake Foundation, an ambitious redevelopment project begun in the mid-1990s that over the past 30 years has transformed a low-income community and is still going strong. It is currently run by President and CEO Ilham Askia, who has a fascinating resume of her own. Before coming to Eastlake, she was co-founder of an Atlanta-based nonprofit called Gideon's Promise, which focuses on providing services to people who rely on public defenders for legal representation. I went to visit Askia at her office in East Atlanta to talk to her about both of those projects and how they connect. It was a good conversation that covered a lot of territory and offered some specific ideas about confronting complex issues of justice and equality. Seth, let's go to the tape. My guest today is Ilham Askia, president of the Eastlake Foundation in the great city of Atlanta. She holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University in City, Urban, Community, and Regional Planning, and a master's degree in Elementary Education and Teaching from Trinity Washington University. She started her career as a teacher in Washington, D.C., and then moved to Atlanta with her husband, defense attorney Jonathan Rapping. In 2007, Ilham and her husband co-founded the nonprofit Gideon's Promise, which provides training and support to public defenders across the South and across the country. It has emerged as a crucial voice for the right of effective legal representation for indigent defendants. After 15 years with the organization, during which she served as executive director, in 2022 she took her current position with the Eastlake Foundation, a community and economic development agency that over the past 30 years has transformed a whole neighborhood with an unusual asset, a top-level professional golf course. She currently serves as a committee member of Leadership Atlanta and serves on the board of directors for the Society of International Business Fellows. She also serves on the Charles R. Drew Charter School Board and the National Head Start HSN Board. She lives in Atlanta with her husband and 2 children, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity to speak with her today. Thank you so much for your time. To start with, can you tell me a little bit about your background and what kind of led to this lifelong professional focus you have had on education, justice, and community and economic development?
So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's always great to talk about the work that I've done over the last 25 plus years. That means a lot to me. So I think what really started, I started my career in education. And that actually was an interesting journey because I wanted to be a lawyer first. I grew up in a community where, really tight-knit community in Buffalo, New York, large family. My cousins were almost like siblings to me, even though I had 3 other siblings that lived with me, and just wanted to give back to community. I always liked to serve people, but I didn't know at the time that service was my passion. And so I started my career in education because I wanted to eliminate the school to prison pipeline. A number of people near and dear to me fell victim to the criminal legal system. And oftentimes I saw the consequence came about because of the lack of supportive teachers and educators within the community and the broader city. And so first I said, well, I'm going to go to be a lawyer to stop this from happening. But then I realized it was deeper than that. We really needed to start early in life and start with little people. And so became an educator, did that for a number of years in Washington, D.C., and then later Atlanta, Georgia, and then fell into criminal justice system reform through Gideon's Promise, which was then the Southern Public Defender Training Center. So the reason why my career journey has been different pieces and different aspects, from education to the criminal legal system to community development, is because they all intersect. Mm-hmm. And so for me, service to people, service to community was important. And then how can I use the talents that were given to me to really give to community and work with community. And so starting Gideon's Promise with my husband was like the second iteration of my work, leaving education system and going to the criminal legal system, because I saw if the education system failed its children, the criminal legal system would gobble them up as adults. And how can I prevent that? Build great public defenders to do the work.
And my understanding of Gideon's Promise is it came out of work that your husband did in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, where he went down there and helped to kind of rebuild or maybe even build new public defender offices there. And that led to his awareness of how much need there was, not just there, but across the country, really. Can you talk about that a little bit? I think a lot of people who don't have direct experience with the criminal justice system are probably aware that there's such a thing as public defenders. And they maybe think, well, that's just how it works. If a defendant can't afford a lawyer, they get appointed one that takes care of them. And obviously that is more or less how it's supposed to work. But what are the challenges that system has that Gideon's Promise was formed to try to address?
So over 80% of people who are accused of a crime qualify for a public defender. So, a public defender is a criminal defense lawyer who is assigned by a county, a city, or a state, depending on the charge, to represent people who cannot afford legal defense. And so some of the challenges that we saw heavily concentrated in the South, which is why we started Gideon's Promise, formerly Southern Public Defender Training Center, in 2 states, Louisiana and Georgia first, the New Orleans office and the Atlanta office in Georgia, was because we saw passionate, committed young public defenders going into systems where the culture of that criminal legal system was just to process people, to just this churn style revolving door of processing people through the system. And what happened is those passionate lawyers started to lose the very reason why they went into the criminal legal system and defend people in the first place. They started to become part of the problem of processing. And so we started Gideon's Promise because we wanted to develop the next generation of thoughtful, caring public defenders. So you should get platinum service defense representation regardless of income. And so Gideon's Promise produces some of the best public defenders in the country. So that was the why behind our work. We expanded that work beyond just the southern region and became a national organization in 2013 when the outpouring of public defender offices said, we want to change the culture of our office, which would then change the culture of the whole criminal legal system in our jurisdiction.
Can you talk a little bit about what that culture change looks like, what the training is? Because I think people might think that the most obvious need in public defenders' offices is just resources, having funding, having enough staff. And I know that that's a challenge, but you're talking about working within those parameters. So what is the model that Gideon's Promise tries to promote and inculcate?
So there are three areas that causes challenges in public defender systems. There is the structural challenge, there's the financial implications, which you just talked about, and the cultural piece. And so for us, the structural is how does leadership work? How are people, how is the system and processes, how is that functional in the system? How can we repair that, right? The second piece is financial, having enough resources. There's a lot of advocacy that went on when we first started Gideon's Promise, and still to this day is parity, right? Something as simple as paying public defenders the same equal amount that you pay the prosecutor's office. Public defender offices were getting a third nationally across the country of what prosecutors' offices were getting. Prosecutors could decide what cases go forth. Public defenders do not. Whatever cases come through, if there is a public defender office there, they must accept the cases. And so how do you provide financially the resources to properly defend someone? And then the cultural piece, the cultural challenge of the criminal legal system on public defense was how do you provide a place that's inclusive, that the culture of talking to clients and interviewing clients, understanding the family dynamics, the community, that's the piece to understand that it is a noble profession and it is a profession of excellence. That is the part that Gideon's Promise addressed. And how we addressed it was a few areas, focusing on new public defenders right out of law school or with less than 3 years of experience, and teaching them the standards of how great representation and what it should look like, how it should be and what it should look like, and then continuing for 3 years, during their first 3 years, to provide ongoing training, mentorship, and support every 6 months for the first part of the career. Because once you develop those great habits, you continue along. And then later, those young, new public defenders then become leaders in their offices with understanding the type of culture that is needed to be a best-in-class office. And then we also provided leadership training and support to what they're called the chief defenders, the directors of offices. How do you take this model, right? How do you take this client-centered model of public defense representation and make sure it spreads throughout your office, from the administrative assistant all the way to the heads and the supervisors of the offices? And so those three areas, young lawyers, mid-level management through our trainer development program, and then chief defenders who are leaders of the offices, how do they collectively work together to change the culture? So we provide training. Gideon's Promise provides training and support for those different groups.
What impact have you seen from that? Gideon's Promise has been operating now for 18 years, and you're in, I think, 29 different states. But what are you hearing from people? I mean, because by this point, probably some of those people who went through those early trainings 18 years ago are in senior level positions. So what difference is it making out there?
So, I've been away from Gideon's Promise for about 2 years, but I do sit on its board. But what I have heard, first of all, some of those new lawyers, those baby lawyers, became the heads of their offices. So when you think about Nashville, metropolitan Nashville in Tennessee, that office is led, the senior leader team are Gideon's Promise trained lawyers. The chief defender in the New Orleans public defender office, the Orleans public defender office, is a Gideon's Promise graduate, right? He's a leader that's gone through the program. The former head of Still She Rises in Omaha was a Gideon's Promise trained lawyer and started as a young lawyer. So what we are finding is that it took time, right? This is a marathon, not a sprint. It took about 10 years to get those folks that I just mentioned, and so many others since then, to really embrace the culture and then become the leaders of the offices that is the standard set forth moving forward. And so what we have seen is intentionality in service and providing support for people who are accused of crimes. When you think about the people that come before the courts, it is often, social determinants that bring into account. It's poverty, it's education, it's homelessness, it's sometimes substance abuse. And so people end up being defined by their circumstances and not who they are. Public defender's responsibility is to talk about who the person is that is before you. And so now we see leaders that is the standard when you come into their office. If you are in a Gideon's Promise office, those leaders really have embraced what it means to be client-centered.
Well, so talking about some of those core underlying issues, after 15 years at Gideon's Promise, you came over here to the Eastlake Foundation. Can you talk a little bit about what continuity you see between the work of Gideon's Promise and what you're doing here, which is this kind of large-scale community and economic development effort?
So one of the big things, so I will say this, Eastlake has always been near and dear to my heart because when I moved to Atlanta, Georgia in the end of 2004, I knew no one in Atlanta, and I came with a newborn. My husband, Jonathan Rapping, was recruited to come to the state of Georgia to help build its training division for the statewide system that was just enacted in 2003. So that's how we got to Atlanta. The Eastlake Family YMCA was my first anchor and home in terms of community. And so they welcomed our family. They had a daycare center, and it's still going on now, that watched your child for 2 hours while you worked out. So I started to learn about the community in terms of just all the amenities that were offered. My kids played soccer here. They learned t-ball and ballet. And so Eastlake was my first community, although I lived on the south side of Atlanta. East side, Eastlake is on the east side. And I just thought, wow, what a great community to live in. Like this actually exists where you have all these resources. I participated at Eastlake Family YMCA for 10 years before I learned about what was once here. Uh-huh. I had no idea in the 90s that this was a community that had families and children that wanted all the resources they could possibly, wanted their children to thrive, but were in circumstances that they did not create that made that thriving almost impossible. And so the Eastlake Foundation was established in 1995 to help with the community transformation, which was focused on mixed income housing, cradle to college education, and now we say cradle to college and career education, community wellness, and economic vitality. And so all the resources and supports that we, the Eastlake Foundation, give with its community partners is why this community is thriving. There's still more work to do, but we are really excited that we, over the last 30 years, have impacted generations of families. So the question is, how did I go from criminal justice reform to community development? Well, as you read in my bio, I have a city planning degree, I have an education degree. I'm a child that grew up with very, very humble beginnings in subsidized housing. Back then it was called the Projects in Buffalo, New York, and then later we had our own place through Habitat for Humanity. I recognized if we can pour in to children and families on the front end and provide all the resources and access that they want, then we start to lessen their chances of ending up in the criminal legal system. whatever that means to folks. And so I saw it was like a marrying of all of my passions of serving people, of education, social impact work, and social justice work. And so, and a little bit of urban planning sprinkled in. And so I ended up at Eastlake when the search firm reached out to me, the board of directors, because number one, the community had given so much to me and my family, unbeknownst to me about what was here before, and they embraced us anyway. And then number two, it marries all of my passions, and I understand what it's like to be a child, number one, of a formerly incarcerated parent, a child who grew up with in humble beginnings with limited resources, but whose mother did everything she could to put me in the right spaces at the right time. And then I also understand where I ended up, but where children can go. And so why not give back to and work with community to do the same thing for other families and children. So that's how I ended up at Eastlake, why I said yes to it.
Mm-hmm. And to give a little more background on Eastlake for people who aren't familiar with it, it's an interesting model because the redevelopment was really driven, as I understand, by a real estate developer who was especially interested because there's a golf course right here. There's the Eastlake Golf Club, which is a world-class golf course, but it had kind of fallen into disrepair as part of the whole suburban flight Atlanta disinvestment era that you're talking about. And so it's this interesting partnership between a golf club and the Atlanta Housing Authority and local residents and local businesses that all kind of came together around this, right? And the result of that is that the community has redeveloped, the golf course has revitalized and is now home to the PGA Tour Championships here every year. And then the proceeds from that actually go to support the foundation, right?
A portion of the proceeds, yes.
Right. Sure.
So to take us back just a little bit, there were things happen in parallel. There was the Eastlake Meadows housing development, which was in disrepair, which was in need of a significant overhaul. The president of the Tenant Association there, her name was Eva Davis. Eva Davis and her colleagues within the community, the public housing community, were advocating for years for support, right? So that was going on before Mr. Cousins even purchased the golf club. Mm. When he purchased the golf club, a couple years behind when Ms. Davis was really advocating with the city and the state to invest in the community, I always say two unlikely allies got together, right? He was restoring a historic golf club that was built in 1904 that was in disrepair after the Atlanta Athletic Club left and went up to the north side, and some of the legacy members stayed. They really needed someone to help restore the Eastlake Golf Club, which is the home of Bobby Jones and Alexis Sterling. And so while Mr. Cousins was working on rebirthing, if you will, the golf club, Ms. Davis was in process of wanting to provide quality living places for families that lived in Eastlake. And so you can't do one without the other. And so the architects of the vision, Tom Cousins, Eva Davis, and Renee Lewis Glover, who was the president, the CEO of the Atlanta Housing Authority at the time, along with former Mayor Shirley Franklin and a number of other government officials, came together to reimagine what Eastlake could be, right? At the time that this happened, Eastlake had, the crime rate was 18 times the national average. The graduation rate of our high school students was less than 30%. Unemployment was at an all-time high. And over the last 30 years, we have completely reversed that. Over 97% of our families are employed. 98% of our children graduate from high school. And it's just a thriving community. And so the architects of the vision said, how can we do something bold and audacious, right? And really help families while still preserving the integrity of the why behind the work.
And what do you think are sort of the portable lessons from this model? Because obviously, not every area in need of reinvestment has an asset like a golf course or something that might be attracting outside interest. But what in that matrix of partnerships and, shared, if unexpected, interests do you think can be educational for people in other places?
So it's interesting you asked that. So purpose-built communities. So because of our work at the Eastlake Foundation, a national organization called Purpose-Built Communities, who is actually led by the CEO is Carol Naughton. She sat in my seat years ago, right? So the role of Purpose-Built is to take the Eastlake model and replicate it across the country. So this is going to sound very familiar, which is also the why taking this role was interesting to me, is because you have a national organization that has a model for a holistic community transformation. And now you want to implement that model across neighborhoods across the country. So Purpose-Built is in 26 other neighborhoods. So when we talk about how do we look at lessons learned from Eastlake, the innovation that has happened in Eastlake, and the continued preservation of the families that live here, the legacy residents, and the work. So what we have done at Eastlake is partner with Purpose-Built Communities to actually go out and inform what works well, what doesn't work well, based on the neighborhoods that are interested in the model, right? Some of our neighborhoods, we call them community quarterbacks or anchor organizations, begin with their YMCA. Others begin with their neighborhood association. Others start an entirely new nonprofit, similar to the Eastlake Foundation, and they become the anchor institution to help disseminate the work, right, and implement the work with partners. So this is not just done in Eastlake; it's done across the country, and it is working. And neighborhoods are in different stages. Some of them mirror what we look like in the 1990s, right? The 80s and 90s. Some are a little further along. And so Purpose-Built Communities' responsibility is to serve almost as a consultancy for neighborhoods to figure out how to implement this model that works for them.
And of course, people can find out more about Purpose-Built Communities and the Eastlake Foundation online, and I'll put all of those links in the show notes. I feel like anytime you talk about community development and reinvestment, you inevitably run into questions about displacement and gentrification. And I know that it has been very intentional here to create and maintain a mixed income community. How has Eastlake balanced, not just in the context of what's happening here in the neighborhood, but rising housing costs across Atlanta, across the country? How are you managing to balance those needs?
So it's a hard thing to do. This work is not for the faint of heart. I will say one of the things that is important to note is that the Eastlake Foundation works with a number of community partners. We could not do this work. It's called the Eastlake Initiative Partners. So our early learning centers, our school, our K through 12, pre-K through 12 school, our housing partner, Columbia Residential, which manages it was then Eastlake Meadows, now the Villages of Eastlake. Emory's Guzweta Business School, right, that does the entrepreneurship program in the community, and the Eastlake Golf Club and Charlie Yates and Tour Championship. So we don't do this work alone. So how do we keep the integrity of the neighborhood? Gentrification is real. And so the role of the Eastlake Foundation is to continue to support families who are in the community, to keep them here by providing resources. If you're interested in home ownership, we partner with the Atlanta Land Trust now. We have 40 townhomes being built right now, affordable townhomes that support families at 80 to 120% area median income, which means between $68,000 and $100,000. I'm so bad with my math, about $100,000. So for us is, how do we, the Eastlake Foundation, financially invest and programmatically invest in our families to maintain and keep people here? We don't want people to leave. And we have lessons learned, that folks who wanted home ownership had to leave the community because they couldn't afford it. And so every day we are trying to innovate and create new ways to keep our families here and prevent what happened in a number of neighborhoods across the city where gentrification push people out. And so working with our partners, understanding the needs of the families that attend our different centers, and the community feedback. One of the big pieces that's important, when I left Gideon's Promise, it was being client-centered was the theme, and it still is. At Eastlake Foundation, one of our core values is resident-centered. So we do not do any of the work that we do without being informed about what residents need and what they want. And that's how we try to push constantly against some of the things that are happening, that some of them which are out of our control.
So you're marking 30 years this year. That's a real landmark for any innovative initiative like this. These are the kinds of efforts I feel like sometimes you'll hear about, but then if you go back to check on them 10 years later, they might be kind of falling apart. The different parts of it haven't worked together well, or, a key partner has pulled out. But you've kept it going. So what comes next? What are your priorities going forward?
So 30 years, and I can't take credit for all 30 because I've been here too, but I will say that my predecessors did a great job, I think, giving the layup to the work that I would like to do during my time here in this seat. And so, as I mentioned before, our 4 pillars, mixed income housing, cradle to college and career education, community wellness, and economic vitality are our focus areas. And there's a lot that goes underneath those areas. My team and I, who I love dearly, they're a great team to work with, are really focusing on the community wellness pillar and the economic vitality pillar over the next couple of years. We are still building housing and recreation space and community space, the brick and mortar, right? It's still going on. But because there was a heavy emphasis in the beginning on that, right? You build a safe place, people will thrive, right? Once you feel secure in your basic needs, you can focus on the other things. So now we are focusing on the other things, mental health and well-being. We are focusing on economic vitality, so economic mobility, home ownership, financial health, financial literacy, not just for adults, but also for youth. We have a Wealth Builds initiative that begins next month, focusing on our children. How do we advance education and financial literacy? What about estate planning and credit repair and budgeting? And so really investing in the social part, right? The internal part for our families is the next level of our work, while still focusing on the brick and mortar and the education pieces. Those will not go away. The last piece on community wellness is social cohesion. We've had a lot of families move into Eastlake. Some who don't know who the Eastlake Foundation, what we do and who we are. Some who don't know the history and the legacy or the why this continues to be a successful community. And so our goal is, how do we bring community together? So this 30th anniversary gives us opportunity to bring Eastlake residents together, but also the greater Atlanta community together. Because when Eastlake thrives, everybody else thrives.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. So I just want to say thanks again for sharing your experience and insights with us. Between the criminal justice system and affordable housing and community development, I think you're engaging with some of the most complex challenges that we face across the country, certainly across the South. So thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now we're to our arts and culture segment. One of the odder social media trends in recent years was a burst of young people on TikTok doubting that Helen Keller was real, or was really blind and deaf, but still able to communicate. As with many things young people say on TikTok, it was hard to tell to what degree this conspiracy theory was sincere. But it was, in its own weird way, a sort of tribute to the very real Helen Keller and the scale of her accomplishments. Not only that she learned to communicate despite her disabilities, but that she graduated from Radcliffe College at Harvard, wrote 14 books, and became a political activist for causes including women's suffrage and labor rights. She was one of the founding members of the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920, and was, for most of her life, one of the most famous people in America. She was still alive when the hit play The Miracle Worker, based on her childhood and her educational relationship with teacher Anne Sullivan, opened on Broadway, and when the film version in 1962 won Academy Awards for its 2 stars, Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke. Keller died in 1968 at the age of 87. By then, the house where she was born, a property known as Ivy Green in the small city of Tuscumbia, Alabama, had already been turned into a museum paying tribute to her life. The house and the 10-acre property it sits on remain open to the public. My wife and I visited on a recent road trip that took us through northern Alabama. It's a lovely property, and it includes the original iconic water pump where Keller made her first communications breakthrough with Sullivan. It also includes an outdoor theater, where every summer since 1962, the Helen Keller Birthplace Foundation has presented a live production of The Miracle Worker. This year's show opens this weekend on June 6th and will continue on Friday and Saturday nights through July 19th, except the weekend of Independence Day. It is a staple of the local theater community as embodied by this year's director, Caroline Self. A local native, Self literally grew up in the play. She first appeared in it in a small role and then over the years played the roles of Helen Keller, Anne Sullivan, and Keller's mother, Kate. She's a Radcliffe graduate herself and has directed the summer production for the past 5 years. You can find ticket and showtime information at themiracleworker.info, and we will link it in the show notes as well. If you get a chance to visit, you'll also find yourself in proximity to several other notable arts and culture sites. Tuscumbia is part of a cluster of 4 adjacent cities, known collectively as the Quad Cities, or just the Shoals, that also includes Florence, Sheffield, and Muscle Shoals. They are home to 2 legendary recording studios, Fame and Muscle Shoals Sound, as well as the birthplace of pioneering composer and bandleader W.C. Handy, who was born in Florence. You can visit the preserved wood cabin where he grew up, just a few miles from Keller. That wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. If you do feel moved to make a donation, first of all, thank you. And second, make sure you make a note in the comments accompanying it that it is for the Progressive South. Thanks to Bark for our theme music and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. We'll talk to you soon.